This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of the word and of the word made flesh. And I said that wrong. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. So welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer, Courtney, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with our new team. This is our first pre-recording, and we have Timothy Knotts and Stephanie Meter with us today. It's Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023. And Jennifer, why don't we let Tim and Stephanie have a minute each to introduce themselves, and then you can introduce what we're doing.
Sounds good.
Hey, Timothy, who are you? We lose Tim? How about Stephanie? Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Stephanie Meter. I did CC from 5th grade all the way up through Challenge 4. And I now work on the curriculum development team as the subject matter person who loves the exposition strand. So I like to read all the books and write about the books and talk about the books.
Well, we're so glad to have you join us. And how about you, Tim?
Hey, sorry, I'm having some internet issues, I think. Yeah, I'm Timothy Knotts. I'm the debate strand writer for Classical Conversations Multimedia. And my family and I have been involved with Classical Conversations for more than a decade now.
Great. So we lost at you after you said you were writing for Debate Strand. What did you say after that?
My family and I have been involved with CC for more than a decade now.
It's been a long time for all of us. Okay, Jennifer, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself this time too?
I will. So I have been in Classical Conversations since 2005, and 3 of my children have now graduated all the way from age 4 through age 18 through Classical Conversations. And one of them has actually finished college and is in the workforce. So I'm now serving as the Senior Global Curriculum Director for Classical Conversations. And I'm like Stephanie, I really like to read. So this book club is a lot of fun for me.
That's good. Yeah. If you look at the Classical Conversations curated curriculum on our bookstore, we have about 80 pieces of literature, fiction, nonfiction, original sources that our students read over the challenge years. And so I think all of us have read them all more than once. So it's good to have you guys with us. Yeah. Okay, so Jennifer, why don't you tell us about the book club this month?
So we tend to have a theme every month. And so this month we are going to look at some great classics of British literature. So today we'll start with Beowulf, and then we'll move on to Pilgrim's Progress, and then Father Brown Mysteries, Pride and Prejudice, and Mere Christianity. So that's a lot of different genres to give us to enjoy and relish over the month, but they are all united by being classics of British literature.
And I think we're just really fortunate as Americans to have that British heritage behind us, because they had children's literature around the same time we did. And so we were all writing good books that were accessible to the family. All right, so you can access all of our past episodes on my YouTube channel, which is at Leigh Bortins. Just go to YouTube and type that in. You can also go to leighbortins.com if you want to link through to the archive. So Jennifer, you want to get started with our conversation for today?
Yeah, and if you listen to a lot of these episodes, you'll notice that I always ask the same question first. So Leigh, I'm going to ask you, why is Beowulf in the Classical Conversations catalog?
Yeah, so some kind of like practical reasons are we wanted to study British literature, so we went back as far as we could in the sense of what was easily accessible for families. And also, it's the beginning of the school year when we're studying both Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales, and they're unfamiliar to a lot of Americans' children. So it was really important to me that we could find a couple of books that were authentic, that had good translations, that were really from a way back historical period, and yet were accessible to the students and their families. So Beowulf is just one of those timeless classic stories. Angela Jolie just made a movie about it in the last 10 years again, and so it's very easy to read, and the story is very interesting. And there's a lot of, blood and violence in it, as well as a lot of Christian themes.
Yeah, that's a good description, Leigh. I like that. There is that mix of sort of the Saxon epic with Christian themes that the poet later wove into the story. So hopefully we'll get to talk about some of that today. Whenever I have read this book with groups of, 15, 16, 17-year-olds in our challenge programs, universally the guys really love this story because it's got some great heroes and some great action and great villains in it. So it makes for a really a page turner in a way that you might not think. So
yeah, that's good. The other thing is, we do Latin as one of our major grammatical studies, and I also thought it was important for students to see that even our own language has changed a lot. And we have versions of Beowulf available that are very readable, but you can get them in Old English still. And when we first started out, that's what we used, was an Old English version, so the students could see how much their language had changed.
yeah, that's fascinating. Good. So whenever we've talked about this in previous book clubs, but whenever we're reading something that might be difficult or less familiar to us, it helps to start off by staying on the surface. And so if we use a familiar tool like the story sequence chart and look at all the parts of the story, it can kind of help us then understand what it means. So I thought we would do that today and start at the beginning with having Stephanie tell us a little bit about the setting for this book and the characters to help us get started.
Sure. So Beowulf takes place in Denmark with kind of a Scandinavian feel, and a kingdom that is terrorized by the monster/demon Grendel. And Grendel lives in some swampland that is nearby, kind of outside the realm where the people are usually congregating. And the time we're thinking is about 6th century, so way back. Some of the main characters, we've got Beowulf, who is the archetypal hero that we think of and we want. He's brave, he's strong, he's noble, he's confident. And he hears about the terror of Grendel and comes over to help King Hrothgar. And King Hrothgar is an older, wiser character. He's a little bit static in that he doesn't change a whole lot throughout the story. And he has a more reflective attitude towards heroism. So he kind of asks us to contrast at different times young heroes versus more mature heroes. And he is married to Queen Weithau, who is kind of a classic queen hostess. She's very well dressed and respectful. And she represents this hospitality and kind of the social aspect of good relationships with people. Later on in the story, Beowulf does have to fight Grendel, that monster/demon. And this monster lives in that swampland outside the human area, and gets us to ask questions about what is a monster. The poet kind of has a grotesque portrayal of Grendel, but also maybe is asking us to think about if Grendel is jealous or lonely. And so what makes a monster, and how does somebody get to be a monster? What's Grendel's deal? There's a lot to talk about with that character. And then later in the story, we get to look at Wiglaf, who is Beowulf's friend and helper, and reminds us that a lot of times big battles can't be fought and won without people supporting us and helping us. So he's an important character as well.
Yeah, I love that, Stephanie, because as you were talking, all I could think about were all the echoes of, that theme of hospitality running through the Greek epics also. And so Weithau and Penelope from the Odyssey have a lot in common. And then you're talking about the sidekick. So you've got all these great pairs of warriors in the Iliad. So this is a great one to also prepare us to later read even older epics, because they all kind of have those same elements to them. So
do you think that's because there wasn't McDonald's and BP down the street, so you had to be hospitable in a way that we wouldn't even imagine?
Yeah, absolutely. There was nowhere else was anyone going to stay. So, and there are also expectations that run through this book that run through the epics. If you're a warrior and you defend a kingdom, the king is supposed to give you treasure. That's his obligation to you once you've won in battle. And so the giving of rings and other treasures is a big theme here in this book. So I saved the next question for Tim because Stephanie doesn't like spoilers, but since you've already read this one, Stephanie, it's not really a spoiler to you, but for our readers who haven't read the whole thing, Tim is about to tell you the entire plot. So if you don't like that, You might want to not listen for a minute. Okay, Tim. So tell us, this story is kind of divided into 3 adventures for Beowulf. So can you tell us about those quests?
Sure. Yeah. I don't believe that there are any spoilers for books that are more than 100 years old.
That's true.
That's fair.
That's
This
fair.
is real old.
So just, yeah, quickly to piggyback on what you and Stephanie were just talking about, part of the reason for this whole setup is that the king of the hall here, Hrothgar, his father, and Beowulf's father had a previous relationship. And so there's this sense of obligation and even sort of maybe like family that goes on between them, just like in the other ancient epics, where once you've been a guest, like you've given guest gifts to somebody, there's certain expectations, social expectations between you that limit what you can and can't do on the field of battle, or what you're obligated to do to help someone else out. But Beowulf hears of the troubles that Grendel is causing, because for 12 years, Grendel comes in and sort of sneakily comes at night and takes from the city, from the town, from Hrothgar's hall, and kills Hrothgar's men. And so Beowulf comes along, both to sort of, I think, do some things that his father and Hrothgar's father had going on in the past generation, but also he comes declaring that he's going to win glory for his own king, the king of the Geats. And when he shows up, there's some things that go on with sort of some of Hrothgar's men sort of testing him out and seeing, is he really all that, or is he just coming in and puffing himself up? But after they have this feast celebration, in comes Grendel, just like he's wont to do, and Beowulf grips Grendel, and they have a sort of a wrestling match, and ultimately in a lovely gory scene that delights young men, Beowulf rips Grendel's arm right off, and Grendel sort of slinks off back to the swamp where he's from, and they all cheer and hang the dismembered arm up on the ceiling from the rafters. But Grendel goes away, and ultimately he does die, or they assume he's died, but he doesn't die before he makes it home. And Grendel's mother, who's 10 times meaner and 10 times badder than Grendel himself, learns of this, and she comes looking for who it is that has done in her son. And so she comes in and wreaks havoc, and Beowulf has to go and track her down in her home out in this swampy region and in a cave. And he goes and has this sort of epic fight with Grendel's mother, and he's taking whacks at her with his mighty sword, but she's invulnerable to his attacks until he finds another sword there in the cave, and he grabs it and ends up cutting right through her and killing her in the cave. And of course, in the cave, he discovers a great treasure. So he comes out of the cave and goes back and returns to his home, Geatland, and with all this treasure, ends up becoming the king there. But rule of threes, along comes another monster, and this time it's a dragon, a big fire-breathing dragon, who comes and he and his 11 best warriors go out to battle to fight the dragon. And it ultimately comes down to just Beowulf and as Stephanie already mentioned, this most loyal friend and follower of hers, Wiglaf. They have the fight, they do battle with the dragon. Ultimately, they prevail, but Beowulf is critically wounded and dies, and Wiglaf becomes the new king. And they bury Beowulf with great pomp and commemorate him.
Yeah, we're going to take a close look at that burial scene later, because that's one of my favorite scenes. So you probably heard lots of echoes. I know, Leigh, this is something you and I have talked about before. It's just the influence of something like Beowulf on J.R.R. Tolkien. So did you want to say anything about that as we're...
Yeah, and also what allude to what Timothy said, and even Stephanie, about books being over 100 years old, and that you shouldn't have to explain too much about them. People should be aware of them. This translation we're reading by R.R. Gordon is actually 100 years old last year. So just
Oh.
even our translation's already old.
Yeah.
And during that same time period, 1922, when Gordon was doing the translation, Tolkien was doing his own. And I think even Lewis worked on parts of it. It was just, it's such a classic book that all kind of people who are interested in literature use it not just as translation tool and to get to know Middle English better, but also as a way to help them create their own myths and stories that they're going to write. So it'd be interesting to have a comparison and a challenge seminar after finishing reading The Hobbit to go back and to say, all right, is there anything in Beowulf that you recognize in The Hobbit now? And, you know, it might be very superficial. They're children that we're working with, but I think you'll find some allusions. And I think I started thinking about why some of the books are in our curriculum. I think it was because I wanted to wait 30 years and be able to talk to them with grownups who've read them 3 or 4 times too. They just, it never ends how enjoyable they are. And so when I reread it this morning, and that's all it took me, was an hour this morning. It's not a long book.
Yeah.
But you know, it's just, it's like the Bible. There's new verses in it every single time, right? Because it's not the book changed, I changed. So I just really appreciate you all joining us. And that's about all I want to say about Tolkien.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, there's over 100 translations of Beowulf that are in print right now.
Yeah. I do have to tell a story because Tim was talking about how awful Grendel's mother is and how difficult it is to kill her. And there's all this backstory about how Grendel and his mother are descended from Cain, who, you know, is the first murderer in history. And so I had a class one year, a Challenge 2 community full of guys. There were 10 guys and 2 young ladies. And we were past this book and we were reading Pride and Prejudice, and they really did not like the character of Mrs. Bennet, the mom of all the girls. And so one day I said, well, let's do a character comparison chart, because Jane Austen's all about characters. Who do you want to compare? And they said, let's compare Mrs. Bennet to Grendel's mom. I was like, why would we do that? But okay, I did say you could choose whatever you wanted. And after they did this whole comparison chart on the whiteboard together, they stood back and looked at it and said, wow, sometimes moms do really bad things when they want to protect their children. And I thought, that was an interesting lesson to get out of that comparison. So.
It's true.
Yeah.
They come up with the best exercises if you just give them a good question.
Yes. Yep. They do. It was a great day. So we talked about setting, we've talked about characters, we've set up the plot and its 3 main parts. So Leigh, usually the next thing we talk about is conflict. So we either talk about man versus man or man versus nature. What kinds of conflicts did you find when you reread it this morning?
Yeah, there's a couple that I hope we can spend some time talking about. The one is, you just said man against man, and I was thinking this would be really interesting to talk about man against woman and how we just, you know, I think we have this so-called progressive attitude of how medieval people or ancients treated women, and like they were just slaves and they had no power. And this book totally shows the opposite, that the expectation is that no, they're going to have power and that you better watch out for them. So that I think is interesting. And then there's of course man against nature, and you could just make a simple case about the dragon and Beowulf. But the other one that's always really interesting to talk about is the either man against God or man against himself, depending how you want to position it, because Beowulf is that heroic character Stephanie set us up with, but that means he's also flawed. So he has really good things about him and really bad things about him, or things to overcome versus attributes to admire. So they're in there. There's lots of them. So do you want to talk about some specific ones, or Stephanie, did you have one in mind?
I always like the question about what kind of conflict is in a book, because I think depending on how you interpret them, you can find a lot of different ones. So we say maybe man versus nature with the dragon, but also if you just think about the character or the dragon as a character, then it's kind of man versus man in a way. And I think pretty much every story has a little bit of man versus himself, because that's usually what the conflict is about. How is the character going to respond to the circumstances presented to him? And there's usually a little bit of an internal conflict, especially towards the end of the story. I think Beowulf, whether he consciously decides or not, he needs to decide, is it more important to live and be the king for these people, or is it more important to defeat this dragon? And so that's kind of an internal conflict of what's more important. Is it irresponsible to leave the people without himself as a king? Yeah, so I love conflict questions.
Yeah, and that one's, as I've grown older, that's the one I keep coming back to, Stephanie, is Beowulf versus himself. And especially just trying to answer questions of how your role changes as you age and you have physical limitations. And when do you know to walk away because you can't do something anymore? This, by the way, is the theme of the new Top Gun movie, for those of you who haven't seen it. So you can compare that to Beowulf too, but just that idea of your own limits, and when is it time for you to try to exceed them, and when is it fitting for to live within them?
And in these epics, right, this epic and the ancient epics and some of the others that are from the medieval era, the conflict is often whether the hero will stay true to his virtue, right? His whatever the thing is that he's supposed to embody. And here you have from the beginning to the end this idea of glory. And whose glory is it? Will Beowulf pursue merely his own glory, or will he be a servant to others in the way that he pursues glory? Will he serve Hrothgar, or will he serve self? Will he serve his people, or will he serve himself? Right? Those are the kind of some of the great questions that that create conflict within him.
Yep.
Yeah, and
So-
again, that's that same conflict that Achilles faces, I think, in the Iliad. Is he's been told in advance, if you go to the Trojan Wars, you won't come home alive. And so he has that same choice before him. Am I going to pursue a long life, or am I going to pursue death and glory?
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing that's good about the author, at least, and how he positions Beowulf for us, is there's a lot of biblical references throughout the book. So I highlighted a couple. Is it okay if I share?
Sure.
No. So one of the themes that was pointed out actually in a lot of blogs on the book was this phrase: most often he, meaning God, has guided the man without friends. And it's not that Beowulf was friendless as much as that he was on his own with the battle, right? The armor wouldn't work, the sword wouldn't work, his soldiers wouldn't work. He alone had to hang on and wrestle, which has that allusion to Jacob, of course, fighting with God, but you could even maybe make the case that Jacob was fighting his own demons while he was wrestling with God, and God was pointing that out to him. So you have that kind of allusion. And then when he's describing the battle with this horrible, wicked mother who's got the same kind of strengths, Beowulf says, the fight would have ended straight away if God had not guarded me. So just that kind of language is everywhere. And then, I did this for my Lord and Savior, and may the Lord that protects us help us in our battle. It's just everywhere. And I was thinking, for somebody who doesn't really know how to teach literature, but would like to introduce the children to this, is you could go through and just visually scan pages and look for biblical references. So like you showed us on another video, Jennifer, about how you write through your book. So you can underline every time you see the name Hrothgar or Beowulf, so you can follow the character's path through the book. But you can also follow other things like, the Lord, or this, like the sword is almost a character in this book, isn't it?
Yes.
Right.
And
So you could just, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that was one of the things that the young men in my class really enjoyed, is the naming of the swords and the armor and all that goes with that. And then I was going to say too, what you brought out is important, because this poem does sit at a crossroads where there's a transition from ancient ideas of fate to Christian ideas of providence. And you definitely see that woven into this poem. It's a clear moment in history where we're transitioning toward a Christian epic. So those references are important.
I think that's helpful that you said it's a transition, because the book is very pagan also. But that's why it's the transitionary point. I don't think I ever talked to my students about that. And I'm wondering what other books in the curriculum serve as transitions. I think about, I bring up all the time, Bambi, the movie, how before Bambi, there was no thought of gun control. But as soon as that mother was shot, gun control has been an issue for the American population ever since. So it'd be interesting to look at other books in reference to what transition were they at.
Yeah, well, we talked about that a little bit on last week's call. I don't remember how we weren't talking about To Kill a Mockingbird, but we were. Oh, I think it was on Norms and Nobility. And And we were
Mm.
talking about that idea that Atticus kind of sits at that moment of transition. So civil rights have not yet come to his community, but he is seeing ahead to where they need to go, and he's
Mhm.
pursuing that. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Good.
So,
So
good. I think we're
those
at the midway point. So do you want
does
to?
that mean I should do an ad?
I think you should do our ad. Yeah.
Okay, let me pull up to it. Okay, so it's time to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where all the books we discuss can be purchased. And we have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leighbortins.com with links to the exact books at the CC book site. This book in particular is part of the literature studies for Challenge 2 students. And like we said before, I'm going to read you off the book site. This is kind of a recap of what we said in the first few minutes. It's one of the oldest pieces of English literature, and its portrayal of heroism influences society even today. Iconic heroes like Superman mirror the character and decision-making styles of Beowulf, and even Tolkien took inspiration from this narrative poem. So these are the kind of notes that we have on our bookstore about our books. If you want to know more about why we have the curated curriculum we do, visit classicalconversationsbooks.com and read it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, that description too of superhero makes me think we should really emphasize that here. These are larger than life characters. The monsters are larger than life. Beowulf is larger than life. So it very much is like the current genre of superhero movies, but with even more things to emulate. So that could get some students really interested in reading it. So good. All right. Well, we are going to now do one other way to get into an unfamiliar or difficult book is just to take a passage in it and read it aloud together and discuss what you see in it. So we're going to practice that for the next portion of the call. So Tim, do you want to read our first passage for us?
Sure. This is right from the beginning of the book. So we'll start right there at the beginning. A very good place to start. Beowulf, a son of Skull, was renowned in Scandinavian lands. His repute spread far and wide. So shall a young man bring good to pass with splendid gifts in his father's possession, so that when war comes, willing comrades shall stand by him again in his old age. The people follow him. In every tribe, a man shall prosper by deeds of love.
What did you guys hear as Tim was reading? I think the first thing that leapt out to me was that the young man should bring good to pass. He should be doing good to the others.
And it's from the gifts that were in his father's possession.
Right.
Right. And then the whole, because I was thinking of my 4 sons and how in every tribe a man shall prosper by deeds of love. What makes them do well is not themselves, but the people they've surrounded themselves with, and the heritage they've been given, and the friends that they choose, and the church that they attend, and the people they serve.
Yeah, I love it that it's introducing this grand epic that's full of battles and conquests and monsters. And it doesn't say in every tribe man shall prosper by his great deeds of conquest or by the might of his arm, but instead by deeds of love.
Yeah. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch. So going back to that idea of legacy and the idea that these were gifts in his father's possession, and now he is the next generation. He is the steward of that legacy, and he's expected to behave a certain way because he's been given these gifts. It's, again, this is another echo of scripture where people are given talents and they're supposed to do a thing with them. But it's also a precious reminder that all things are in our Father's possession, and he entrusts them to us as his children to do good deeds with.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, to whom much is given, much is expected, and to whom much has been forgiven.
yes.
Much grace abounds, right?
Yeah.
It's also interesting to note that he begins with a big reputation, right? His reputation had already spread across Scandinavia. He wasn't like a young buck out looking to make a name for himself for the first time. He actually had a lot to lose before he ever went to Hrothgar's hall. but he had that duty, that obligation, like we were just talking about. He he went there, yes, to seek glory, but also to honor obligations of his father's house. So it's not just that he inherited his father's gold, but he also inherited his father's relationships and his father's obligations.
Yeah.
You know what else he inherited is his father's name, right? Beowulf, son of Skuld. And I was thinking about how in the scripture, it's always very clear either who your father was, or sometimes it's not your father. Sometimes it's the city you're from, that your whole community is who you're representing, not just your father, but the community your father built is responsible. And so we still do that, right? By having our husband's last names as being part of our family. So instead of saying William, son of Bortins, we just say William Bortins, we drop the son off. And I think our culture has forgotten to remind our children that your first name's just your first name, that it's the last name that really means a lot more.
Yeah.
And then, we go and women change their names. Why do we change our names? Because that's what the Lord did. Every time he blessed somebody in the scriptures and had expectations of them of being a servant along his side, he changed their name. And so we do that, and to recognize that, I'm not Leigh Bryant anymore. I'm on the Bortins side now. It's my job to be his helpmate. So just the whole naming it's so foreign to us as moderns when we read these words and they sound old, like son of Skuld. But really, we do the exact same thing. We just don't notice it.
Yeah. And it is that idea is sometimes can be foreign to us too, that fidelity to the past and to our family's name is really important. So again, if we're echoing other things that we read, if you look at the Aeneid, this is the important thing for Aeneas. He is faithful to his father and to his father's legacy. And that is why he's called the man of piety. And we're in danger of losing that idea of fidelity to your family line, but that's a really important idea for us to uphold. So,
yeah, we could have a really ugly conversation that I don't want to have as to all the things that are destroying the family. And they're exactly for that reason. They do not want you to know your heritage or your legacy, because those milestones and markers might make you rise above the problems and the challenges you have instead of succumbing to them and embracing them selfishly.
yeah, it's true. Yeah. Well, let's look at our second quotation. And this is when Beowulf has already killed Grendel. And these are the words that Hrothgar says to him to honor him. So Leigh, do you want to read those for us?
Sure. In this place, Hrothgar's Beowulf's surrogate father, because his own father's not there. Now I will love thee in my heart as my son, Beowulf, best of men. Keep well the new kinship. Thou shalt lack none of the things thou desirest in the world, which I can command. Full often have I for less cause bestowed reward on a slighter warrior, a weaker in combat, to honor him with treasures. Thou hast brought it to pass for thyself by deeds, that they glory shall live forever. The all-ruler reward thee with good things, as he has done till now. Of course, referring to our Lord.
Yes, I loved that reference at the end too, because it's that clear parallel between God as the king of the universe and Hrothgar as king of his realm, and they both are givers of good gifts. And that's important for Hrothgar as the king, that he is behaving like God behaves. So
I have a question for Stephanie. Do you remember reading this while you were in Challenge?
I do. Yeah.
And did you remember being able to understand it? Was it something you could grasp or otherwise?
Yeah, it was. I was actually kind of surprised. I remember being a little intimidated as I began, reassured that it wasn't that long, but still a little bit intimidated. And I think I understood it. It was for sure enough to discuss well in community. And the story itself is fairly easy to follow. It doesn't have quite as many threads as some of the other stories.
Because the reason I asked you is in reading this out loud, I mean, this is another thing you can do in Challenge if you're not quite sure how to lead the students through a discussion, is just read these poetic words out loud. We don't speak this way anymore. And saying them helps you to hear the beauty of it when sometimes your eyes don't engage enough because it's too unfamiliar. So having your voice and your ears can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think we did do a lot of that, and with Canterbury Tales as well.
Mhm.
Just that reading aloud in community, even if you've read it, you can't hear it too many times. So if you completely missed it and didn't understand, that's really hospitable. And if you thought you got it at home by yourself, reading it together in community and just hearing it out loud is so helpful, and really, I think, primes the pump well for discussions. So I like that we are reading these quotes and talking about them.
Yeah, and we've talked about being in the surface level today, but there's an even more surface level, which is just you can enjoy the sound of language.
Mhm.
That is a part of poetry. Just enjoy the way it sounds first. Sometimes we're too busy digging in, trying to figure out what it means. It's okay to stay on the surface and just listen to the sound of it for a while too.
You know, that parent who's trying to figure out how to tailor and just hasn't figured things out. You know, we want you to read enough of the book that you can participate in the conversation in the seminar, but enough of the book may be 1 or 2 pages read out loud before bed each night because your child's not a fluent reader, or because you have a whole family that needs to be read to. And, you know, so getting the book done isn't always as important as getting it done well enough so that you can go, here's another conversation I can enter into.
Yeah. And I want to point out too that for different books, it makes sense to listen to audio versions. So what do I mean? These were tales that were recited around the fireside, around the home as entertainments. And so they are good ones to choose if you want to listen to an audiobook. They weren't written like a Dickens novel, which was meant to be read by an individual silently in their home and then discussed with a friend. They were meant to be recited out loud. So that I always tell my students that about Shakespeare plays too. You should see a production.
Wow.
You should listen to a production. These things are meant to be heard, and then you can read. It's okay to do it in that order too.
Mhm. One thing I remember was, this was with actually the Aeneid. My son John was on a basketball team with a bunch of homeschoolers, and they were playing against a private school. And one of his teammates got off the court, and John looked at him and said, "Stop acting like Achilles. You're so selfish." And the guy got off and said, "Yeah, you're Agamemnon. Stop bothering us and yelling at us." Right. And so, you know, I don't know that they knew a whole lot about those books because they were young men reading them, but they knew enough to pull some words out.
That's great. I love that. The classics and basketball. That could be a whole other podcast right there. Were you having a thought about this passage, Tim?
Yeah, we're getting back to the text here. This sort of adoption by Hrothgar of Beowulf has some more of these really Christian themes, right? These biblical themes of Hrothgar taking Beowulf into his family and making him a son. And you know, that's clearly a biblical theme that we have too, right? Our Heavenly Father adopts us and makes us part of his family, and in doing so, not only makes us part of his family, but lavishes rewards upon us as well, and views us with the same kind of great pleasure that Hrothgar takes in Beowulf. So, you know, those are such good things to talk about, not just in community, but in your home, right? To talk about the beauty of salvation and the wonderful gifts that God gives his children, that we as earthly fathers want to be imitators of our Heavenly Father, but he does it perfectly, and we do it imperfectly.
Yeah, that's good. And even there's that echo in this, thou shalt lack none of the things thou desirest. It echoes, you know, he shall give you the desires of your heart. And when he says, thou shalt lack none of the things thou desirest in the world, which I can command. So again, that's a time to talk about our Heavenly Father owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He owns all the things. So this is a shadow of that kind of giving, of that ability to shower out rewards. So.
Well, and then people will misuse that scripture. And I was thinking about how this helps clarify it. The things that you desire, the things that your father taught you to desire, the good things. And of course, Jesus is referring to his own father when he's talking about I desire to do what you want me to do, Lord.
Right. So many good echoes. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, I want to go and let us look at one more passage, and then we may have some final thoughts after that. But we started off the discussion. So the first quotation Tim read was from literally from page 1, right at the beginning. And so I always think it's good to close with a passage from the end. And so I thought we would look at the death of Beowulf that we've alluded to. So when Beowulf dies after the dragon battle, they all the warriors build a burial mound and they cast their treasures onto it, and then they begin to honor him. So Stephanie, will you read this one for us?
Sure. Then men bold in battle, sons of chieftains, 12 in all, rode about the mound. They were minded to utter their grief, to lament the king, to make a chant, and to speak of the man. They exalted his heroic life and praised his valorous deed with all their strength. Thus it is fitting that a man should extol his friendly lord in words, should heartily love him, when he must needs depart from his body and pass away. Thus did the men of the Geats, his hearth companions, bewail the fall of their lord. They said that among the kings of the world he was the mildest of men and most kindly, most gentle to his people, and most eager to praise.
That's a pretty good epitaph.
Yeah.
So I have to say that one of my favorite things at the British Museum is the treasure hoard of Sutton Hoo, which is a burial from around the time that this poem was set. And you can see the shield and the treasures that were cast into his boat with him when they gave him a burial at sea. And so they ended up being able to excavate this entire burial hoard. And that, I just remember the first time I went, standing there going, oh, this is Beowulf's burial and I'm getting to see it.
Mhm.
So it's fun for me to reread this passage.
That's really fun. I didn't know you've got to do that. I want to go now.
You do. It's great. It's a great exhibit.
Something else that you can do if you can't make it over to England is go online and look up new obituaries and old obituaries and compare them to this one. I have one from a great uncle who died around 1890s, great uncle, and it's very flowery like this. And then I go and I have my father's right next to it, and it just says where he worked and the name of his children. It's just so meaningless in comparison. So what a wonderful way to describe somebody's life. And it's not even describing his life. It's describing how the people who loved him.
Yeah.
Also really a great passage to compare to that opening one, right? You have the beginning and the end, and in our story, analysis, looking at the sort of the setup and the completion, right? We've arrived at that ending piece, and we see now how it worked out for Beowulf, right? That it talked about how he would win renown by his deeds of love, and here at the end you see his people singing his praises, not because of his might in battle, but because he was the mildest of men and gentle and eager to praise others who deserved praise. So it's a really beautiful parallel, right? A beginning and an end to the story to show how it worked out. And some good things for us to ponder too, as we think about the fact that our curriculum, those themes by year, we move towards leadership, and what does real leadership look like? And if we follow after even this mighty man of battle, it's to be kindly and gentle and eager to praise others.
Yeah, and I think he had to grow into that a little, I would argue, because there is that scene at the beginning where he is having a little bit of a competition with Hrothgar's men. Because you can imagine they're thinking, who is this outsider coming in to rid us of the monster? We're the mighty warriors of Hrothgar. Now there's this other guy coming in. And he does get into a bit of a boasting contest with them. And so the fact that here it says he was most eager to praise others, you feel like he grew up. It's one of the great things about his old age is that he became eager to praise others. So.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting right at the beginning when they because all the death starts really quickly. This sentence stood out to me that said, and they suffered this for 12 years.
Yeah.
For 12 years he ate their people.
Yes. That's a long affliction. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
And
right.
this one little thing I would say here is when they say the Geats, his hearth companions, that we didn't get to really talk about this, but that is a fun thing you can go through the book and look for too. The sea is called the Swan Road, and these are his hearth companions. Those compound words called kennings are a fun way to stay on the surface of the book too.
Oh my gosh, we need another 2 hours to talk about this book. You can read it in half an hour or so.
I know, exactly.
But it was really great having you guys on. And I want to thank everyone who listens to our recording and remind you to keep the conversations going. Thanks, team. See you.
Thanks.